My name is Simone Cupid. I'm a Media Accessibility Specialist at AMI, and today we're here to talk about media accessibility and making accessible content. The first thing that we have to do as any describer is we have to tackle the societal misconception. The greatest misconception in society is that blind people don't access media. Now, media is comprised of a number of different things. So we're talking television, film, podcasts, newspapers, commercials, all kinds of social media platforms. And the societal misconception is that blind people do not use these mediums. But by the numbers, it has been proven that 96% of adults who are blind or partially sighted do indeed watch an average of 4 hours of TV a day. Now, this is just TV, so we're not talking about advertising billboards. We're not talking about your iPhone. We're not talking about your computer tablet. We're talking about strictly the television screen. 4 hours a day is just slightly lower than your average sighted viewer. Blind people do access media, not to mention that everything these days happens on a screen, whether it's a digital screen off the side of the highway or it's the screen of your phone in your hand. Let's talk about what accessible media actually is. Accessible media is a service that was developed primarily for the blind and partially sighted audience. It is a service that makes the visual verbal. So as a medium, we tell stories through pictures. With this particular service, we now have to turn those pictures into verbal descriptions. So you're making what's normally visual into a verbal element. And you do that by leveraging your conversation, your gaps in conversation, your actions, your sounds, your music, etc., etc. Where do we begin? What is the most relevant thing to have to describe in that frame that you're looking at? If I were to take this exact moment in time, I would say that the most relevant thing that we're looking at is probably this PowerPoint presentation. Everything else is just a secondary factor that happens to be visual, but isn't necessarily the point of what we're trying to look at. Concise, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go on. What am I going to say and how am I going to say it as quickly as possible? Because we have all heard the old adage that a picture is worth 1,000 words, but we only have maybe 4. Okay, accuracy. We have to make sure that what we are telling our audience is accurate because they are relying on us to be their eyes. And if we do not tell them something that is accurate, then we have lost their trust. So it's very important for trust between the audience and the storyteller that you provide them with as accurate information as possible. We'll talk a little more about that as we go on too. Pace. Any piece of media that you are presenting is going to have a different pace. I like to give 3 examples of what I mean by pace. Let's suppose you're watching 3 scenes of a movie. One is a war scene. One is a love scene, and the other one is a family dinner scene. Now, as a sighted viewer, you would not watch those 3 movie scenes with the exact same intended emotion. The war scene is going to have shrapnel and blood and guts and whatnot flying around, and it's going to be highly intense, quick moving, loud, and it's probably going to have matching music and tone. The love scene is going to be exactly the opposite. It's going to be slow and drawn out with matching music. It's going to be sultry, and everything is going to take time to be drawn out in order to create that mood. And then a family dinner scene might be a bit of comic relief, or it just might be, a lighthearted moment on camera. As a viewer, I wouldn't watch all 3 of those potential scenes the same way. So as a storyteller, I'm also not going to tell those 3 stories the exact same way. And we have to avoid subjective interpretation. What is subjective interpretation? That means, what does Simone want you to believe the movie's trying to tell you? It is not my job as a describer or an accessible media content creator to tell you how to feel about my product. It's my job to create in you the feeling, the sensation, the emotion that I want to create in you as a storyteller without having to come out and say, I need you to feel sad right here. It's not Simone's job to watch the movie, the show, the documentary for my audience. It's Simone's job to help the audience watch the documentary. Let's break these down a little bit, and we're going to start with relevance. I'll show you a couple of different images. Specifically, what are they? These are specifically Dorothy's ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz. This is a famous piece of filmography. It's iconic, and the story could not be told without these very famous ruby slippers. So let us suppose that the audience watching The Wizard of Oz has never seen the color ruby or red. Is it important for me to mention that those slippers are red? In this case, it's very important to mention that those slippers are ruby red because it is the technical name of the prop. It's the technical name of the piece of iconic filmography, and it's how it will always be referenced, the ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz. So whether or not your audience has ever seen ruby red or any similar color, it would be very important to denote that these are specifically ruby slippers. Let's suppose that this is your image, a stop sign. Do you think it would be important to note that the stop sign is red? The fact that the stop sign is red is irrelevant in this case because no matter what continent in the world you travel to, stop signs are red. They're red in Japan, they're red in South America, they're red in North America. Stop signs are always red. So unless the stop sign is blue, there's no need to say the red stop sign. And that would be the difference between relevance and not relevance. Extra superfluous prolixity. It's a really long, fancy way of saying redundancy. We're going to talk a little bit about conciseness and how to get your message across in clear, quick language so that everyone can understand. What does this phrase say? The jovial poking of fun is the burden of your personal being. The joke's on you. So instead of taking 11 words to say the joke's on you, just say the joke's on you. Because the jovial poking of fun is the burden of your personal being is going to be lost on anybody. That's really all it's saying. How about this one? It appears to be satisfactory from a good distance away, although greatly removed from all right. Looks good from far, but far from good. We can say something in 20 words, or we can say it in 5. The best rule of thumb is always to say it in as few words as possible. Get in, tell the audience the piece of information you need them to understand, and get out and let your project continue telling its own story. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about accuracy and intent. We do a lot of talking with our body. We have to think about these things when we're trying to produce accessible media because the blind, low vision audience cannot access your body language. We have to be very cognizant about whether or not we are intending to be sarcastic. Are we intending to be literal? Are we intending to be exaggerative? And if we're trying to tell those with simple body language, the message will be lost on our audience. As storytellers, we use many elements to tell our story. Logos, establishing shots. Where are we in this movie? We go from one place to another. Where are we now? Perhaps it's a graphic we're utilizing to showcase what we're talking about. Maybe it's somebody's interpretation or a subtitle from another language that we're subtitling into English. Maybe it's just a lower third and we're identifying the speaker and their title and their job description. Maybe it's an on-note screen that's going to lead us into the next scene and has something to do with the storytelling and the furthering of the plot line. Maybe it's as simple as the credits. But there are a lot of things that we use in our storytelling on screen that are purely visual elements that will not work if you're making an accessible story. They're elements that you'll need to figure out in advance before you roll cameras in order to make those elements accessible to all audiences. We're going to talk a little bit about using sound. Let's listen to a few sounds. As sighted viewers, if we were not in the room and I played those sound effects, we would know exactly what they were. You would not need to see a phone ringing in order to know that a phone was ringing. These are everyday, very common sounds that do not in and of themselves require explanation. Perhaps what about those sounds may require explaining in your story is if a phone rings and it's important whose phone rings. Is it Simone's phone that rings? It's not necessarily important that a gun goes off. What may be important is who pulled the gun and who shot whom. Use your sound effects as much as possible in all storytelling, just like all movies, all films, all documentaries. We encourage you to do all of the same things. The only thing you have to remember is if there's an element that goes with the sound effect that is unclear in the story, that part of the story may need clarification. Let's talk about some overall areas when you need to start thinking about accessibility as a content creator. You need to think about accessibility when you're writing your scripts. From the minute you decide that you have a movie, show, a documentary, from the writing of the scripts is when you have to start thinking about accessibility. When cameras are rolling, it's too late. You have to think about your hosts, your actors, your guests, and educating absolutely everybody that's involved in the project, because only if everybody is aware and looking for the same things and the same end result will we have an accessible project at the end of it. If not, it's very, very possible for some things to slip through the cracks. Introduce speakers as they are going to speak. The blind audience associates my ID with my voice pattern. So to introduce me 20 minutes before I'm actually going to speak on air does them a disservice. And planning text. Again, these are things that we have to we have to consider before our cameras roll. How will we handle our subtitles, our headlines and lower thirds? How will we handle websites, Twitter handles and phone numbers? How will we handle calls to action and credits? They have to be considered before we roll cameras. Also, think accessibility. If you're changing scenes, if we're doing a documentary about a hockey player and we go from inside the hockey rink maybe to the locker room, how do we translate that we change locations? Portraying action, say you're going to cover a couple minutes of the actual hockey game. How are you going to portray to somebody who can't see the action on ice what is actually taking place? Capturing B-roll. How are you going to fill in and cover your jump cuts and all those less attractive parts of your story? Be very cognizant of the B-roll you're capturing. For example, let's say I use the phrase, amid the skyscrapers of Manhattan, New York. If I say that, my B-roll should show the skyscrapers of Manhattan, New York. Be very cognizant of capturing B-roll that tells the same story as your audio story. Be very cognizant of how you're going to cover things like graphics, visual jokes, gestures, and body language. Social media, some best practices. Omit the www. You never need to put it in. The internet will put it in for you. Just put in what it is that you need to put in and leave it at the .ca, the .com, the .org, whatever the tail is. Anything past that gets far too complicated for somebody who can't access a pen and paper and quickly scribble it down. So simply send them where they need to go. Hopefully when they get to that website, they will be further advised. Please visit us at ami.ca. Calls to action. The basic rule is to say it first, spell it second, because plays on words are something that can't be visually accessed by the low vision audience. please contact us at onewithone.com. That's WON with ONE.com. Say it first, spell it second. Some general tips for making accessible media content. Introduce your guests as they appear. Ensure your interviews work for radio. If you can do the same thing with your picture medium, then you've got a really good IDV accessible media piece. Avoid gesturing. See behind me? Take a look at this. Did you see that? Look over there. And be clear who's being addressed. Thank you for joining us for our presentation today. And to you at home, thanks for tuning in. Be very clear when and if you're breaking that fourth wall. Thank you for joining us in studio today, and thank you at home. Just makes it very clear who you and you are. Things to consider. This, that, here, there, see, and look. None of these 6 words is descriptive. Each of these words is directive. They're telling the audience to do something. See this? Look at that. Come here, go there. You're directing them to take another action and not fill them in on that action. So those 6 words are your key 6 words to know that as a describer and an accessible content maker that you have a void to fill. Last but not least, don't sacrifice creative storytelling. We're still media content makers. We're still here trying to engage audiences and tell compelling stories. Please do not sacrifice the creativity of your storytelling. Just always remember to cover these few key elements so that you include every audience in your storytelling. Thank you.